If you think about comics, sooner or later you'll think about time. Not just the time that has gone by since you were a kid and had read your first comics. Even if that nostalgia factor is obviously very important for many comic readers. The desire to go back in time to remember happy childhood days. But I don't want to talk about that aspect of time in comics. Neither I want to talk about time in the comics, be it the passing of time in a story, the aging of characters, or the literal time travel stories or other plot devices related to time. I don't want to talk about that either, even though it would be an interesting topic. And I don't want to talk about the history of comics. That goes back until the cave paintings in the Stone Age and has countless predecessors in the Old World, before it got a crucial push with the newspaper comics in the USA. But that couldn't be handled in one video alone. Sounds more like a pitch for a whole series of videos. What I want to discuss here is the importance of the time that it takes to create a comic. The time an artist gets or takes for his creation is, in my opinion, one of the most important determining factors. For me, it's maybe the decisive reason for the difference between European and American comics. Generally speaking, European comic artists have much more time for their creations, while in the US there is obviously this enormous output each Wednesday and the machine has to be fed. Each title has to have an issue each month, else the audience gets a bit uneasy and disturbed. In Europe, usually a creative team doesn't put out more than 1 or 2 issues out each year. The typical European albums have 42 up to 46 oversized pages. It means that a fan base for a European comic series can be satisfied with 84 pages in a year, which is a considerably lower page count than the content of 12 American comic books. 12 times the usual 24 pages makes up to 288 pages. So even if you have to consider that these pages are smaller, it's still more than 3 times the page count that an European artist has to deliver. I am not an expert by any means, but I think this has a lot to do with the magazines in France and Belgium, which have published comics since the 1930s. In the beginning, there was, I guess, Spirou in Belgium, which published American and European comic series. Later on, there were all the other ones like Tintin, Pilot, Metal Hurlant, or in Germany, copycats like the magazine Zack and Schwermetall, and whatever magazines in the other European countries. From the Franco-Belgian comic magazines, only Spirou survived until the recent day, and of course there's this restart of Metal Hurlant with the editor Graham Morrison. So even if these magazines aren't around or really important anymore, their importance back in the day can't be exaggerated. They were published weekly and contained serialized stories, so you got the stories in little bits of 2 or 4 pages each week. As spoiled as I am right now with huge omnibuy full of long storylines, this memory terrifies me a bit, I must say, but for the artist it meant enough time to develop and create a story. Later on, the concluded stories were usually published separately as a European album-sized comic book. Today, with most of the magazines gone, the stories are nowadays usually published only and straight away as a comic album, without any kind of pre-publishing. But I think they owe the good old magazine days the slower publication rhythm. And we, the comic reader, are rewarded with comics that, of course, very generally speaking, are more well thought out and contain less fill-in, repetitive trash compared to the American comic books. While it's quite naturally for European comics to be drawn by just one artist, who usually does the inking and sometimes the coloring himself, and he stays on this title for years, if not decades. For American mainstream comics, it seems you can be glad if an artist stays on a title through one story arc. Not to speak of the last trend of double shipping, the production of 2 monthly issues of a title, which is absolutely impossible to do with just one artist. So you have a constant rotation going on, which is actually a no-go in my opinion. In this way, comics turn from a work of art to a serialized industrial product, which at least mainstream comics have always been, more or less, to be honest. But double shipping cements this victory of economy over quality, which is a bit of a shame. Please don't misunderstand me, I love American comics, but the ones that mean the most to me are the comics from independent artists who could take the time they need for their creations. I know that I maybe romanticize here a bit and that independent creators aren't always that independent and have to face many kind of pressures as well, but I think you get the idea. Otherwise, it can be interesting when a comic artist limits his or her time deliberately and consciously, like in these 24-hour comic happenings or events, when an artist and some friends come together and do a comic in 1 day's time. I show you here a German example. The necessarily rushed, wild and spontaneous results can be very refreshing, even though you seldomly get a classic story out of it. But maybe it can serve as an inspiration and model for a future story or series. It's in any case a good method to circumnavigate a writer's block. Or you do this diary comic kind of thing. Each day one strip, one panel, one cartoon or whatever, which blends your stories or cartoons with the autobiographical aspect of the passing of your own lifetime. Or you slow down your output deliberately, like Josh Simmons does with his Jessica Farm comic. For this very interesting story, a mix of Alice in Wonderland and sci-fi and a bit horror, he draws just 1 page each month. So this story is planned to be concluded after all in all 50 years. 50 years for a comic. It's a fantastic experiment that blends together a big part of the lifespan of an artist, his creative development, and a slowly evolving story. An experiment like John Cage's music piece that's been played in a German church in Halberstadt in the slowest way possible on the organ comes to mind. That piece is played right now and won't be concluded before 2639. In comparison to that, Simmons' comic is finished in the blink of an eye, like our own lifespan. But before I get too profound and melancholic, I rather say thank you for listening and watching. Goodbye.